Hey everyone, welcome back. Even though a lot of talk over the past 2 weeks has been about lunar landing schedules, the biggest thing missing from the talk was the lunar landing schedules themselves. NASA says it's looking for the best path forward to win the second space race, landing the next people on the moon, after saying last week that Starship HLS was behind schedule. But 2 weeks later, we still don't know if they are weeks, months, or years behind, because no new date for Starship or Artemis III was provided. SpaceX says Starship will get the US to the moon faster than any other nation, but they are already scheduled to do that in mid-2027. They provided the first detailed HLS update in years, but still aren't saying anything about the schedule for the Artemis III crewed lunar lander, even as one of the 2026 demos for Artemis was left out. There are rumors about a different lunar lander idea from Blue Origin than their baseline plan, and a concept from a Lockheed Martin group, but no designs or schedules for those either. I'll go through another week with lots of words about Artemis III, but we haven't got much farther than what Sean Duffy started this with, when he said Starship was behind and he was opening up a competition for another lunar lander. The details are important, but we're still missing the dates and the context. And with the date for Artemis III now missing, I was reminded about the interplay between that mission and Artemis IV. NASA still has Artemis II first, and I'll start with that situation, which doesn't seem as complicated yet, but might be headed that way. The government shutdown stretched into its second month at the end of this past week, which means that news about launch preparations for Artemis II has been blacked out for that long. There were two exceptions in mid-October, where Acting NASA Administrator, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, reported the move of the Orion spacecraft to the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center, also seen by media organizations with permanent presence there. Secretary Duffy then posted imagery of the lift of Orion during the mating process a few days later, completing Artemis II stacking mid-month. Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin also released an image of the full stack after the spacecraft and SLS launch vehicle were hard-mated. That leaves out a lot of work during October by Exploration Ground Systems, finishing Orion stacking preparations in the Launch Abort System facility, and the beginning of final launch preparations for the full stack on Mobile Launcher 1 in VAB High Bay 3. It also means we're now completely in the dark about whether Artemis II still has a good chance to be ready to fly when its flight-specific lunar launch period opens in early February. So far this year, EGS has stayed close to the schedule for their goal of being ready to roll out to the pad for launch by the end of the year. Eventually, they will have to target a specific launch period. If that's early February, launch period 17, I believe, they will have to hold off on time-sensitive work, which would actually give them some schedule margin. On the other hand, if they don't have any extra time set aside and miss those few days or nights in February, the soonest the mission could launch would be a month later, around a few days in early March. In the past, NASA would report on completed milestones, and we could at least get a sense of whether work was staying on schedule or near schedule based on that. With only 3 months of time to finish preparations for an early February launch, November, December, and January, an obvious question is how much schedule margin is left. Just prior to the government shutdown and the beginning of the news blackout, NASA officials held briefings at the Johnson Space Center in Houston about Artemis II, and we heard from Lakeisha Hawkins, who is one of the leaders of NASA's Exploration Directorate, that February 5th could be the first launch window within that February launch period.
Thank you very much, Tarek Malik with Space.com. I think for Lakeisha or for Charlie, just about that opening of the window for Artemis II as early February, I'm very curious, like what is that earliest date that you could be looking at in February, and what is the number of days per month that you're looking at to kind of have that time period in which to fly? Thanks.
Okay. Charlie, why don't I start, and then you can help me fill in the gaps, right? So right now, that window could open as early as the 5th of February, depending on how we progress. Of course, there will be more work in order to be able to nail that down. In terms of launch periods, generally those windows go anywhere, our periods range anywhere from 4 to about 8 days. in each month. And so as we get closer, we'll be able to more clearly communicate what those periods could be.
Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell Thompson also said that the launch pad flow is about 18 days with a few days of contingency time. The Artemis II vehicle would roll out from the VAB to launch pad 39B to begin that 18-day pad flow. A couple of months ago, I also got a chance to look ahead to this period of time and ask EGS Acting Senior Vehicle Operations Manager Matt Check about final rollout preparations. There are a few time-sensitive items, like batteries, that can't be installed early to get ahead of the schedule. That work and a critical end-to-end test of the flight termination system require access inside the vehicle, which leaves buttoning up the vehicle as additional work that needs to be completed but can't start until after those time-critical tasks. Mr. Check noted that the last 2 weeks prior to rollout were a flurry of activity. If we put that together, a hypothetical February 5th earliest launch date, an 18-day pad flow, and 2 weeks, give or take, of final rollout preparations, we have a busy and full January calendar. Working backwards 18 days from February 5th would put a hypothetical rollout to the pad on January 18th, and would put the beginnings of that fortnight of rollout preps around January 4th. After subtracting some time for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, what it means is that EGS has November and December to finish all the work steps ahead of that. That would have continued without stopping after Orion was stacked in mid-October, but with the government shutdown, we're in the dark about progress, and the NASA news blackout that results from the government shutdown, and so we have no way of even asking for updates on progress. The government shutdown could also become a direct threat to the Artemis II schedule if it extends much longer. That was the reporting during the week in a couple of stories. Jeff Faust reported for Space News on comments by Lockheed Martin Orion Vice President Kirk Shireman at the American Astronautical Society's annual Von Braun Symposium in Huntsville. Stephen Clark then reported for Ars Technica on a statement given by NASA indicating that all the contracts associated with Artemis II work are funded through early November. That is, of course, also saying that some of those contracts are only funded through early November, which has already started. So we'll see what happens if the shutdown continues farther into its second month. EGS may have some schedule margin left to make the February launch period, but the shutdown has already lasted a month. They might not have anything like a month's worth of schedule margin. In his remarks at the Von Braun Symposium, Shireman talked about impacts to subcontractors, some of whom maybe can't afford to work for a month or longer without getting paid. That could have even bigger impacts for downstream SLS and Orion production. For example, the most recent Government Accounting Office annual survey of major NASA programs noted that supply chain issues were impacting the schedules for the Artemis III and Artemis IV SLS stages hardware. A disruption of payment doesn't sound like it will help. Missing multiple paychecks also isn't going to help the situations of NASA personnel that are working without pay. For Artemis II, they could be working extra long shifts without pay, and just like subcontractors and small businesses, many of them might not be able to afford to work much longer before they have to find alternate sources of income. After last week's big announcement that NASA would look at alternatives to Starship HLS for Artemis III because Starship is behind schedule, the big questions remain unanswered. I noted a few of the obvious ones last week. For example, just how late is Starship? If it is behind schedule, then Artemis III is behind schedule, even though no new date was mentioned. NASA said it had received responses from both HLS providers, SpaceX for Artemis III and IV, and Blue Origin for Artemis V, about schedule acceleration approaches by the middle of this past week. Originally, both of them were scheduled to have been ready for a lunar landing by the first half of 2028. Starship HLS was originally expected to be orbiting the Moon by the end of 2024 for Artemis III, and Blue Origin's Blue Moon lunar lander was set to do the same by April 2028. If NASA is looking for alternatives, it suggests that both systems are in jeopardy of missing the new target date of the end of President Trump's second term, the end of 2028 or January 20th, 2029. For Starship, does quote-unquote behind schedule mean the 2026 milestones are behind schedule? When the president's budget request was published in late May, Starship HLS was supposed to complete all the objectives for the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration, the critical design review, and the uncrewed lunar landing demonstration in this fiscal year, which ends in 11 months. Are those milestones behind schedule, or does it mean that Starship is behind the Artemis III schedule regardless of whether or not they achieve these milestones in 2026? Or both? For Blue Moon Mark II, if the rumors of a Mark I derivative being offered as an alternative are true, does that impact the most recent target given for Mark II itself, which was the end of the decade? And is Blue Origin confident they can do both a Mark I lunar landing system by the end of 2028 and then complete the Mark II system just a year later? On Thursday, October 30th, SpaceX provided a long, detailed update on Starship HLS, maybe their first ever in 4 years, and addresses some of the questions we've been asking for a while. Questions to NASA's HLS program over the past year and longer about the critical design review level maturity of subsystems, or even just programmatic questions about life cycle milestones, like key decision points, were all referred to SpaceX or Blue Origin, like this statement from late July. But last week's announcement seems to have compelled SpaceX to finally respond. The post provides a more comprehensive update on development of subsystems beyond the core Starship elements. These are the type of updates that we ask for periodically from NASA about their programs, rather than once every handful of years. Because we're not getting regular updates, it makes the big picture questions the higher priority ones, and SpaceX didn't address those. To be fair, SpaceX has operated the same way as Blue Origin, or maybe it's vice versa. Both of them have been secretive, with this single post being the exception over the last 2 to 4 years, not the rule. SpaceX noted in their update that they are consistently responsive to NASA, but that was never in question, since that communication is private. The question about communications is about NASA and/or SpaceX being responsive to the public. If this means I can ask NASA HLS for status updates and they don't have to refer everything to SpaceX or Blue Origin, or if this means that SpaceX and Blue will now respond to questions from the public about the status of HLS development, great. But the biggest question coming out of last week's announcement by Secretary Duffy and NASA was how far behind schedule SpaceX is. This update doesn't address that directly. It says that, quote, Starship will bring the United States back to the moon before any other nation, unquote, but all the Artemis III contractors were already supposed to deliver their hardware in time for a mid-2027 launch. Starship is already supposed to land astronauts on the moon in 2027, which would be before any other nation, and they're supposed to land an uncrewed Starship on the moon in 2026. SpaceX says in the update that the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demo is scheduled for 2026 and confirms that the demonstration would begin with a Starship launched into Earth orbit for a long-duration flight test prior to the propellant transfer demo itself. The update also says that the timing of that tech demo will be driven by how upcoming flight tests debuting the new Starship V3 architecture progress, which was already known. If the exact timing isn't possible, can't something besides the opposite extreme, unspecifically in 2026, be provided? Or, put another way, how many flight tests before the long-duration demo launch? And then how many launches from there to the prop transfer demo launch? SpaceX also omitted the uncrewed lunar landing demonstration in the update. So does that mean that demonstration is now no longer scheduled for fiscal year 2026? That leaves the top question, which is when the crewed lunar landing demo is currently forecast. That's the HLS part of Artemis III. What is that date? Either the date for the start of the tanker campaign or for the lunar orbit checkout review. NASA and SpaceX still have not addressed any of that. The update did address the Wednesday deadline for acceleration approaches that NASA asked for from SpaceX and Blue Origin, saying that, quote, we've shared and are formally assessing a simplified mission architecture and concept of operations that we believe will result in a faster return to the moon, unquote. Beyond the schedule acceleration approaches by the current HLS providers, in this week's statement, NASA spokeswoman Bethany Stevens said the space agency would be issuing a request for information after the government shutdown ends to get additional proposals about alternative lunar landing systems. Lockheed Martin indicated last week they were working with a currently unnamed group of companies on lander concepts. It will be interesting if the rumored concepts from Blue Origin using its Mark I uncrewed lander or from Lockheed Martin's group are ever presented in public to any degree. The first two HLS competitions were for public use of private services. The bidders provided only a little detail to their concepts. Unfortunately, we may be in the dark again about the entrants in this new competition. There's also the more critical question of how much money will support this new effort and how soon it will be available. Given the current government shutdown, it's unlikely that any new money is going to become available until next year. And by the time we get to 2026, there will be less than 3 years to accomplish this latest lunar landing deadline/challenge. Everyone remembers Apollo, but the challenges and deadlines from administrations and Congresses since then have been missed, including the one that basically started Artemis to land the next astronauts on the moon by the end of 2024. Then there are the questions about the Artemis III schedule itself, which somehow managed to increase in uncertainty from previously being just aspirational. Going beyond the scheduled chicken PR part of this, the same question applies to the other programs that applied to previous Artemis III delays. Will any of the other programs make their delivery dates? The PR might be the only thing that passers-by catch, but the point here is to go beyond the sound bites. Anyone with more than a casual interest looking at the situation will see that none of the programs are currently ready to fly Artemis III for different reasons. Exploration Ground Systems is the only one of the 5 that is turning around existing hardware, Mobile Launcher 1. However, that can't happen until Artemis II flies. All the heritage parts of SLS, the boosters, RS-25 engines, modified Delta IV upper stage, those were developed or flown or both before SLS was a thing, over 15 years ago. That Artemis III hardware is sitting in storage in Utah, Mississippi, and Florida, and now we're wondering how much longer they will remain there. But contrary to the sound bites, SLS isn't a completely off-the-shelf vehicle. The new element is the centerpiece of the rocket and the most complicated, and it has only been fully built 2 times. Everything else for the most part is new, like the SLS core stage, Orion, Starship, and the Axiom EMU, and the schedules for all of those were already tight. Starship lost this round of PR, but we still don't know if anything else will be ready in 2027. For a mid-2027 launch date, just about all of that Artemis III hardware was supposed to be completed and delivered for launch processing by the end of 2026. We'll see if and when NASA provides any clarity on the Artemis III situation. Bigger picture, now that the Artemis III date was called into question, that same question applies to Artemis IV. What about the schedule for that? Now that a lunar landing mission could be delayed until at least 2028, and maybe longer, that pushes directly into the official schedule for Artemis IV, September 2028. If a lunar landing hasn't happened by then, how long would that delay Artemis IV? Or is Artemis IV already delayed, just as Artemis III was already delayed before the official announcement last week? NASA has formal obligations in terms of setting official launch dates, which means they don't do it that often, but Artemis IV was moved to September 2028 2.5 years ago in the first quarter of 2023 as a part of that budget request cycle. Interim milestones for elements such as the SLS stages for Artemis IV, the core stage and the new exploration upper stage, are already being impacted by schedule slips for the Artemis III hardware during the past 2 years. Even if the hardware for 2 SLS vehicles were available at the same time, which in theory could happen due to other delays, NASA can't prepare and launch them at the same time. Artemis IV is the first launch of the upgraded SLS Block 1B vehicle, which includes extra first launch testing for the flight hardware and the new mobile launcher being built to support SLS with the new upper stage. The delay to Artemis III, even if it's unspecified, again highlights some of these questions. SLS spends most of its launch campaign in the VAB rather than at the launch pad, But NASA only has one place in the VAB where they can stack and check out a rocket on a mobile launcher, High Bay 3. Congress is the main benefactor for SLS, but they have provided only enough funding to preserve the capability to launch it from time to time. Congress has also provided much less funding for Exploration Ground Systems, which is a separate program from SLS. EGS is based in Florida at the launch site. SLS is based in Alabama. Right now, it takes upwards of a year to stack a vehicle and get it ready to roll out and launch. That was kind of the plan between Artemis II and Artemis III. Assuming availability of the Orion and SLS hardware, EGS would refurbish Mobile Launcher 1 after the Artemis II launch and start stacking the Artemis III vehicle next year. The plan for Artemis 3 and 4 is different, but even if it were the same, if NASA delayed Artemis 3 until a lunar lander was ready at the end of 2028, that's already past the current Artemis 4 date of September 2028, and an Artemis 3 launch at the end of 2028 would push Artemis 4 out to the end of 2029, which is the end of the decade. If we just use that 1-year duration for stacking and checkout and work backwards from the current Artemis 4 target, that would mean that the latest that Artemis 3 could launch would be about September of 2027, which is only a few months different than the official mid-2027 date. That brings us back to the differences between the turnaround between Artemis 2, 3, and 4. The Artemis IV vehicle and mobile launcher will need at least a little more time for first-time operations, and EGS will need at least a little more time to reconfigure VAB High Bay 3 from supporting the current SLS Block 1 vehicle and mobile launcher 1 to supporting Block 1B and mobile launcher 2. That suggests that Artemis III would have to launch maybe earlier than September 2027 for Artemis IV to hold to its September 2028 date. It's more likely that both dates are going to slip. With all those constraints, the challenges to schedule between Artemis 3 and 4 were already there, but now we're looking at the possibility that a lunar landing mission could be another year or more later than the current official date. Back at the end of 2019, when then NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine named Doug Loverro as the head of NASA's Exploration Directorate, as it was organized back then, the goal was to land the next astronauts on the moon by the end of 2024. This was before any HLS contracts were awarded the next year. Loverro asked the programs to take a look at what it would take to launch 2 SLS vehicles within a couple of months of each other, as a part of the concept of launching a lunar lander on a single SLS Block 1B cargo vehicle, and then launching Artemis 3 as it remains baselined, on an SLS Block 1 crew vehicle. That would have required taking VAB High Bay 1 out of mothballs, refurbishing it, and reactivating it. That old Saturn V and Space Shuttle integration cell supported simultaneous stacking operations and launch preparations during those programs, but Congress has never invested in that infrastructure. Instead, the shuttle stacking platforms are still there in High Bay 1, and there's still no money to remove them or do anything else with High Bay 1 other than use it as is as a storage location for smaller equipment on the floor. That has been good enough for everyone for over a decade for these programs, and decades farther into the past. So the plan for Artemis 3 and 4 is more of a question mark now that the Artemis 3 launch date is disconnected from the calendar. There's still the question of flying an alternate mission with the Artemis 3 Orion and SLS, but probably not until after we see how clean Artemis 2 is. If Artemis 4 is going to be later than September 2028 on its own, we don't know because that date hasn't been updated in a long time. And it's important to know how late that is too. NASA might need to have a good estimate for all these pieces in order to decide what to do with Artemis 3 and 4. In other news and notes, there were a few notes about the Blue Moon Mark 1 lunar lander, which is scheduled to make its first flight to the moon next year. Will Robinson-Smith reported for Spaceflight Now on updates provided by Blue Origin's Jackie Cortez in a panel at the Von Braun Symposium. In the story, she said that the lander has 3 modules, forward, mid, and aft, which are currently being stacked. She also said the completed spacecraft would be barged from the Cape Canaveral area to the Johnson Space Center in Houston for thermal vacuum testing. That at least gives us a better idea about the status of spacecraft final assembly. During the week, China announced that the first launch of its Mengzhu crewed lunar lander transport spacecraft on a Long March 10 rocket is planned for 2026. Subsequently, it was reported that the spacecraft will be launched on a single-stick Long March 10A for an uncrewed Earth orbit mission that docks to their crewed space station. With the expected spacecraft traffic pattern to their space station, it also sounds like the test flight wouldn't launch until November or December of next year. Thanks as always for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. As usual, a big thanks to the members of this YouTube channel who are helping to make it possible to keep doing these videos. I'm posting more videos and making more frequent updates for members during the week if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.